Hi, you guys. We're so excited for you to join us today. I know that the presentation links have been kind of in the agenda, but we also wanted to provide them here just in case you are changing which session you are planning to attend and joining us kind of at a later time. We'll also be adding it to the chat as we go through the presentation if you have additional colleagues that are joining later on. So for some introduction, so my name is Michelle Gilly. I'm currently a program specialist too for innovative practices, previously known as inclusive practices, here in Poway Unified. And my amazing partner, Barb.
Hi, I'm Barbara Beaudoin. I'm one of the district inclusion specialists. I support secondary spaces and mentor our high school inclusion specialist team.
Couldn't do any of this without her, by the way, as we go through this. So please know that she's a key member of our team. So as we go through today, kind of the description of the presentation, we just want to kind of provide an overview of the systems change that we went through to adopt the alternative pathway to a high school diploma. We know that it's a large undertaking, and as a district who did have a large number of students accessing full inclusion programming previously, there were some pieces of our system that were in place already that we were able to build on, and we know that's not the case for every district. So we wanted to provide the opportunity to access resources, have some ideas, some maybe tasks to think about as a team, as well as look at some of the resources that our teams like Barb and her team members have provided and created. Again, just to try and provide a starting point for those districts that are maybe like either starting these conversations or struggling with the initiation and implementation of this in their spaces. So as we go through, we're going to talk about kind of the foundational information. We know that some of you, this might be new information, and we want to make sure that there's some foundational understanding. We're going to talk about some of the logistics and the timeline pieces that we looked at, what our work group looked at consideration-wise, and then we're going to get into all of the wonderful resources. So we're going to talk about the supports we have, some of the cheat sheets that we've made for families to understand the different pathways, some training pieces that we've used for some of that common language and semantic changes that we made as a district. And then we're also going to talk about curriculum, grading, and then provide you some more detailed examples. As we go through the presentation, there are links to so many different things. We are going to kind of review what each one of them say, but we're not going to pull them all up. So our hope is that if there's something that sticks out to you or something that you want to learn more about or maybe utilize to build something for your district, please go back into the presentation and find those. Or if there's something else that we discuss or describe that maybe we haven't linked in, feel free to email us and reach out, and we're happy to share everything. We believe in not creating something from scratch. We believe in sharing and being open with everything. So please don't hesitate to ask for any of that. Okay, so with the alternative pathway to a high school diploma, so this is, and it's linked in here in case you need some of the legislative language, but it is ultimately a pathway that has been created, which many other states have already had, but for students in the state of California who do have a cognitive disability, for them to be able to obtain a high school diploma. And there's some different aspects to that obviously there are alternative standards in some ways or standard extenders that we're looking at, and there's a reduction of credits as part of that process. But it does create a pathway so that students can earn a high school diploma who historically weren't able to. And our favorite thing to identify with our families and with our community is it provided a situation for our students where they don't have to choose between a high school diploma or accessing our adult transition program for some of our students that maybe needed support from both. It's no longer this or that. It gave them the opportunity to have a this and that, and provide the support that students need for all of their areas of struggle and all of their strengths. And so we love that. We have had creative things in our district before for students that kind of required that support from both realms, so to speak. And this was amazing to be able to kind of create for all. And so with this, there is some legislation that we've linked in just if you need to go back and do some additional research or reading. And so when we look at who's eligible, the students that are eligible for the alternative pathway to a high school diploma are our students with that significant cognitive disability. So these are also number 2 and 3 tend to go hand in hand. So if you have one, you're typically eligible for the other, but not always. And so that's why it is another criteria. So the third piece is that it is a student who's eligible to take the alternative assessment, so the CAA. Now we've linked in the most updated CAA worksheet from the state that helps walk IEP teams through question by question regarding that eligibility. And that was a huge training piece that we took on with our extensive support needs teachers and our full inclusion teachers. And then we expanded out to our resource department. So that was a piece that really took a lot of review and a lot of kind of specific training for our teachers, because before this, the eligibility worksheet was very vague. And so this provided a lot more context and examples. If you haven't seen it, it's basically a stop and go kind of sheet. And so it'll ask you a question, and then based on your answer or the student's score, it will tell you whether you can continue through the rubric or that you are, the student is not eligible and you have to stop the review. So that was a big resource when that came out, that supported our progress through this. The fourth piece is that the student completes the state standard aligned coursework. So that was also a semantic change in the legislative documentation kind of after it came out. And so really for us also making sure that as those updates came out, that we were updating our staff with what the expectations were. So when they changed it to aligned coursework, again, that kind of opened a lot of the conversations about what that looks like, and helping staff understand kind of what those parameters are and what they aren't. And then also once it was updated to include all grade levels, we also had to work through kind of a process of communicating that out, and creating additional pieces of the puzzle for those students that maybe were already seniors and were, ready to move on to the transition program. And now we were looking at a potential option for them to obtain the diploma and obtain those credits, which then obviously changes what that adult transition program looked like. So there was a lot of different stages to this. So I don't want you guys to look at some of the resources or things that we've created and think, oh my gosh, they pulled these out right at the beginning. This is amazing. We have done probably 15 iterations of some of these things. So please know that as you go through this work, you are going to be constantly revising and finding things that your staff need more either examples for or resources for or clarification around. And so our best suggestion is to do it as live documents, whether that's a Canva document or a Google Doc. Don't send out PDFs because you will be sending out 15 different versions of it, I'm sure, over time. So we have a lot of these are live documents that as we receive questions or requests for additional information, we can edit them as we go. So kind of those two things that I bolded were kind of different iterations that came through where we adjusted some of our work too. So the first step was we put together a work group, and I included the names of people not only to give them the credit that is due to them for all the amazing work that they've done, but also to represent the fact that we had representatives from almost every single department in our district. So we had program specialists, we had obviously special education directors, we had our inclusion specialist, but we also had counselors. We had teachers, we had registrars, we had executive directors of our LSS department, which for us is kind of that gen ed side of the house, so to speak. And so we had people from kind of everywhere. We had principals, we had assistant principals, and it really made the work possible. There were pieces within the system that myself as a program specialist or Barb as an inclusion specialist aren't aware of that a registrar is, right? There's things in synergy, there's things in our databases that we have to adjust and create new protocols for, which in some cases require new documents and things like that. So if you are starting this work or revising this work, that's one of the biggest things that I can say is just to ensure that you have a wide breadth of people involved. Looking back, one of the pieces that we didn't include that I would have loved to include is our instructional assistants, primarily those who are already working with some of these students that were going to be eligible. And that was something that, again, as we reflect on our own work, that we try to make better as we move forward. So while they weren't listed here, that is something that we would suggest moving forward. Okay, so implementation based. So this is kind of the questions we went through as a work group. So I've broken them up into three kind of categories. So the first one we focused on was, what is this going to look like? What is it even going to look like? What are the immediate concerns that we're going to receive? What are the barriers that we see either within our culture and climate, within our programming, within our current systems, whatever it is, but what are those barriers that we see? We had chart papers around the room and we went to town, right? And wrote everything out. Then we talked about what materials we already have, what placements we already have. Like I identified, we have a full inclusion program that is pretty robust in our district already. And so we had some foundational pieces that we were able to build on. And then what were our non-negotiables? And I think that was a big one. And so for us, the non-negotiable was limiting it to certain profiles of students or certain programmatic placements. I know I've worked with a couple of districts who started their work in this, and they said it's only going to be the students who aren't in an extensive support needs program. And it's going to be the students that are in full inclusion programming. Some districts went the other way, right? So sometimes you have to do this in phases, which is understandable. But in our district, one of our non-negotiables was that it wasn't going to be done in phases. It was going to be open to all, and we would kind of figure it out. Now, I will say families who have opted into this kind of came in waves and phases of levels of comfort. But we made sure that at least at the beginning, it was open to all. There was no profile of student. There was no programmatic option. There was no type of IEP goal or level of cognitive ability or area of difficulty that was off the table for this being considered for them. And that was one of the things I'm probably most proud of when it comes to some of this work. So we talked about the implementation piece, and then once we had all those kind of big ideas, then we hashed out the procedural stuff. And so this went into what procedures did we have or did we not have that we needed to revise, add to, replace. What were some of the procedures that we had regarding our board policy or cabinet policies that cabinet could approve for our leadership team. So there were certain things, and as a program specialist, again, there are certain board policies that you just aren't necessarily privy to, right? So some districts have board policies regarding how many pass-fail courses you can take at a time. Some districts have had board policies about, right, their diploma requirements. And so, I mean, most districts have that, but sometimes they're different. And so there are things that we had to go into and propose revisions to our school board, as well as our cabinet team, leadership team, to be able to have some of those things revised to accommodate for this pathway for our students and to provide those opportunities. And those are probably the two biggest ones, was the pass-fail grading, how many you could take at a time. We also had some adjustments that we had to look at regarding being able to take pass-fail grading for classes that were A to G eligible. That was another conversation we had to have. And then, of course, adding this as a diploma-bound pathway within our board policy. So some of those pieces were definitely necessary. And I will also, again, I try and be as transparent as possible about our district, because we are very lucky in many ways. We currently have a school board that is so supportive of this work and has been for years, that one of the biggest things was that when this came out, you know, the questions weren't, you know, what are you going to do or why are you doing this? It was, how are we going to help you do it? You know, and that's something that we're very lucky to have kind of whenever we go to them with things like this. So I also want to acknowledge that that's not the case for everybody, and that the conversation may look different. And so please, you know, we have other areas that are difficult for other reasons, not with our school board, but just in general, because we are, you know, a litigious district. So we're happy to kind of talk through some of those talking points if any of you guys have concerns like that, where you kind of need support with how to propose this to a team, right, that maybe isn't super accepting or excited about it. So again, feel free to reach out with us with those types of things, and we're happy to kind of help draft some things. And then our next steps. So this was kind of the third phase, which was what training is needed. So some of the things that occurred were if we needed to train program specialists first, then we needed to train our teachers, our registrars. We just had another registrar meeting where we had to go over this, some of the details and things like that. And then also looking at our parents and our community, and knowing that this is something that many of them have never experienced before and never either thought was possible or never considered, this as a potential option. And then of course there were board presentations regarding the work so that they were updated as we went through. So we do have some of those linked in kind of as we go through the rest of the presentation too, so that you can have kind of a foundational start of what it looked like for us. So when it comes to the supports for this one, so this was the creation of one of the first things we did was the creation of the guidance packet. So the guidance packet, again, everything underlined is something that's linked in. And so the guidance packet is something we created regarding kind of some of the concerns with our ed specialist as well as our registrars. And so if you open it, you're going to see first the outline of what alt pathway is, the criteria, kind of where it's coming from, why we're doing it, what it does. And then it dives into a lot of paperwork. And the first couple of pieces are like 4-year course planning forms for each one of our high schools. It identifies the courses that are required under alt pathway, or the categories, I should say. And then for each high school, it identifies which classes count. Some of our high schools do have different titles for things, or maybe are a different type of science school. And so it allowed teams to be able to look at their own information and really identify what they could do for that student based on what they have or haven't completed. And then it goes into some of the registration paperworks that our registrars required, identifying that we've notified the family that they are eligible, whether the team has identified they're going to access the alternative pathway or continue with a certificate of completion. And so there's some formality paperwork that we have regarding being able to change the things in Synergy, which is our student database system. I just realized some of you may not have Synergy. And then it goes into the IEP paperwork. And I think it's the caveat I will always give is we always tell staff that nothing is black and white. So if we give you certain things, if as an IEP team, you need to change the phrasing to make it appropriate for that student, right? It all should be individualized, but there were some things like checking certain boxes, making sure certain language was on the IEP to accommodate some of the pass-fail grading or the flexible access to standard extenders. And so we provided kind of screenshots of those portions of the IEP so that we can ensure that the students' paperwork is appropriate, and so that we can ensure that our education specialists and our IEP teams make sure they know where everything needs to go. And so that packet is in there for you guys to access and to review. And then we also had some staff trainings. And so with that, we linked them in. All of our high schools did them, but some of them did them in a less formal way. So we have 3 that had more formalized presentations. And so with that, there was kind of an overview of the foundational understanding of inclusion. And then there was an explanation of what alternative pathway was. And then the biggest piece that changed for us was we expanded our full inclusion team to include high school inclusion specialists at every high school. And so part of those presentations were also introductions to those staff members and what that support was going to look like specifically at that site. And there were some nuances depending on the students that were at the school, the numbers of the students, what grade levels they were in, what classes they were accessing, what their programmatic placement was beforehand. So that support looked a little bit different at each high school, just depending on those parameters. So those were the 2 first things that we did. And then we broke it down into kind of some more of the communication pieces. So we had our school board presentation. We had a parent presentation to make sure that they had clarity and understanding regarding what this looked like and what the potential harmful effects were, as well as the potential benefits for their children. And then we also had some student trainings. Barb and I got to participate in a couple of those. And those were more for classes or programs or students that were maybe joining general education environments who hadn't before, or whose peers maybe hadn't experienced that before. And so some of those were just about how to basically be a good friend and be, you know, a human in those moments. And then the other piece was the training for accommodations, modifications, and adaptations. So in our district, that semantic language that I was talking about, we split these up into 3 very specific terms, and we're going to go over that a little bit later too. And we made a clear delineation between each one. And so with that, it helped in IEP meetings, it helped in our presentations, it helped with parents knowing what to expect from everything, that they had a clear understanding of that language as well. So that was huge. And then the inclusion specialist positions also in some cases supported with co-teaching. So they were mostly tasked with the curriculum adaptations and supporting those students and accessing those diploma-bound courses. But in some cases, they also got to co-teach some classes. Simultaneously, we were expanding our support classes and created a unified PE course. And so some of them have had the opportunity to co-teach that and be part of that work as well. So I think, you know, in a world of budget cuts, we also understand that many districts aren't going to be able to fund that. And that is changing for us too. That structure and that system is changing as the numbers of students change and we build capacity in certain places. And so we completely understand that. And so I also don't want you guys to think that you have to hire all these amazing staff to be able to make this work. There's something about what we've created that's really going to make it sustainable for a lot of our ed specialists and building some of these foundational pieces. Some of these foundational pieces are how we're going to get there. So we're very excited about that. All right, so I'm going to pass it over to Barb.
So we looked at making a very clear representation of what the pathways looked like. This helped us a lot when we were talking to parents, when we were talking about staff members and kind of explaining what this looked like and why we were doing that. So feel free to steal and use this as you wish. It made it very clear, like Michelle said, one of our biggest conversations was what do we do with our students who the only option used to be if you got a certificate, then you could access adult transition. But if you got a diploma, then that program wasn't available to you. So this was a conversation that came up a lot, particularly for our students who accessed our ESN classes. Our district, like Michelle said, has been very lucky that we've had full inclusion students forever. Which are students who typically would have been in an ESN setting, and parents have opted to include them within the general ed setting. But those students were in gen ed most of their day with our support for making their curriculum accessible for them. So when this came up for the opportunity for the alternative pathways, we jumped right on it. Since our team had already pretty much been doing that with the curriculum, we just had to change kind of the way we worded it. So next slide, we'll talk about a little bit what that looks like. Sorry, Michelle's going to be my clicker through. So in our district, we learned, and I'm sure this is not unique to us, that the words accommodations and modifications were used pretty interchangeably, with people not really realizing that they hold 2 very different pathways for our students. So we made sure that that was something that was like number 1 on our trainings, was that people understood what the difference is between an accommodation and a modification. So we explained very clearly, accommodations change the how. They're tools for how a student accesses it. One of my peers always says, it's how we kind of level the playing field for our students. So we would have a lot of teachers that would say things like, oh, well, I had to highlight it for them, or I gave them a word bank. And so I'm modifying it for them. And we would have to have lots of reminder conversations of actually, those are great accommodations for those students. They are in fact not modifying. So then when we started talking about modifications, we explained a lot about that it changes the what, that we're no longer talking about the state standards. We're talking about how do we make the work accessible for students and not holding them to that same level. So when it came time for the alternative pathways, we had to explain that you can't actually modify their work if they're working towards credit classes. So we talked about we're more adapting the work to make it accessible. So they're working on work that is related to the state standards. Now it might look very different than what that state standard is, and that's what we'll jump into next. But understanding these three differences was super important. And we make sure to tell our ed specialists in particular that adaptations really just are only used when we're talking about high school and the alternative pathways. For elementary through middle, we stick to just accommodations and modifications. And the only time we're talking about adaptations is when we're discussing the pathway with parents, which we do start that now in 6th grade, even though we don't have to make a decision till the end of 8th grade when we're talking about high school. We start to kind of have those conversations so that it's not something that gets sprung up on parents right in the heat of that transition between middle school and high school, which is already pretty scary for parents. So they kind of get front loaded with this over the course of 3 years so that none of this is new information when we do get to our high school transition meetings.
And one of the biggest things that we also identify, and it's not on this sheet, but it's kind of what we talk about with the teachers in a more informal situation, is that with modifications, you can skip any state standard that you're, or any activity, any unit that you're doing that maybe isn't appropriate for the student. But with adaptations, we're pretty strict with our staff that they have to do something related to what everybody else is doing, all of those things. There's nothing that we can skip or say we don't want to do that unit because it's maybe not appropriate. So that's another, I think, clarification that's helpful too sometimes.
So this is when we talk about adaptations, we base all of our things on this. So this is what the state came out with. It has the standard all the way on the left side. It then talks about what the Common Core essential element is. And then at the end are our descriptors. So we use those as kind of looking at what level do we think the student would be accessing things at. And it gives kind of ideas of like how we would make the work that they're doing in class show that they've accessed the standard. You will notice that from the actual standard to what our lowest level of scaling is can be quite a difference. This, I will say, was probably the hardest part for our general ed teachers to, sorry, the bell, to understand and I would say like accept, because they are drastically different. So for example, this one is talking about interpreting functions, which is a very high level math skill. And if you look down to where the red circle is, it could be that our students are reading a bus schedule. That is a type of graph. It might not be exactly what it looks like when you're graphing functions, but that is something that is functionally relatable to the state standard. Like I said, that was probably the hardest part for our teachers to kind of get buy-in for, and it took a lot of conversations, a lot of growing pains through the process, but we just kind of remind them that our students are working at the level that is most appropriate for them in order to gain access to those standards. So we look at whatever extender is going to make sense for them. And sometimes even that lowest level might not be where they're at. So we can take it a step forward or a step further. And I have some examples towards the end of kind of what that looks like and some ideas of how we've taken it further than just what these extenders say. So another example for English. English has been kind of probably the most interesting one with regards to what we show that our students can do and to what the standard says. Kind of learned that teachers who are single subject take the way that they present things very personally, which I totally understand, and understanding that we have to be really flexible when it comes to some of our students, particularly this group of students who are accessing curriculum that they've probably never had access to before. So this is just another example of writing claims in text, which for our kiddos can be very, very difficult. And it might be then something that they're working on just recognizing when an event occurred. That could be something related to a text that they've read in US history, and then they're writing about it in a language arts or an English class. So just another example of kind of what those extenders look like. So curriculum. So once we knew that we were going to go for the alternative pathways, we needed to figure out like, how are we going to do this and make this sustainable? One of the biggest things was understanding that it is impossible to make a like for like assignment for every single thing that a general education teacher is doing in a classroom. There's no way. They move fast. I'm going to guess our district is not unique in the sense that not every single teacher does the same thing at the same time in the exact same way. So it looks very different in every classroom. So we created a bank of adapted work where we took very specific targeted standards and created this bank. As we've kind of gone through, we have a different Google Drive folder for each one of our high schools, so that now, after this is the end of our second year, we have this beautiful bank of work that can be a starting point for any student who's accessing the alternative pathway. And then we can either bring it up if they can access it in a different way, or if they need a little more support, we at least have kind of a starting point to then break down to further for further access. Again, reminding everyone that the wording changed in what the ed code said, and now it is work related to. It used to be very strict on it had to be a little bit different. So now that it's related to, it gives us a little bit more flexibility as to how we can show mastery of the standard, I think is the best way to word it. So students should be accessing the same material the class is doing through adapting things on the spot. This was a very hard concept for some teachers to understand. We're not creating classrooms within classrooms. This is not the student just has a seat in a room and they're given a fully different curriculum and we just leave them be. This really is an opportunity for social integration with our students. It's a way to teach our neurotypical peers empathy and understanding. I always remind people, like, there's not really a workforce where you're not going to work with somebody who might do things differently than you or understand things differently than you. So it really is a benefit for everybody. So when we present work to teachers, we remind them that the students should be accessing the work that they're doing with the rest of the class in whatever capacity that could be. So it might be that that student is just highlighting keywords. It could be that their instructional assistant is using a whiteboard and writing the answer on the whiteboard and they are just copying it in the blank. It's whatever makes it accessible for the student. They should be active participants in group projects. That's a big one that comes up, and we always put it on. We don't want anything to be grade dependent for the rest of the peers if it's not like a realistic thing for them to take on, like they're going to research this aspect of it. So we like to give them jobs that are at their skill level. It could be that they're finding all of the visuals for that project. It could be a student who's really great at Google and they're building the presentation for it. We do a lot of things with like AI and creating like scripts for students if they're going to do like a video portion of things. So we like to tell them that the adapted work really should only be used during that independent work time. There is always a way to make things like notes or presentations accessible for students. The bottom bullet changed a little bit. When the law first came out, it was very strict that they had to receive letter grades. However, it's now changed that it is an IEP team decision. So a lot of our students do receive letter grades based on their adapted work. And that looks different at every site. Some sites, it's the general ed teacher grading it. Sometimes it is just pulling that adapted work and maybe those like 5 assignments, and that's what they're receiving their grade on. We do have a lot of students that receive pass-fail grading. So if a team decides that the student is going to receive letter grades in the gen ed classes, then any other class that they're taking that doesn't count towards their credits for graduation can be taken as pass-fail with a modified curriculum. Grading, this kind of covers the same thing. So we made sure to be very clear that any grading that is happening, if they're receiving letter grades, should be based on the adapted work, and reminding them that they're not being held to all of the aspects of the standard, that standard is scaled and adapted to meet their needs. So as long as it is work related to, which like I said, can be very drastically different, that is the work that they should be graded on. So we put in a couple of examples just to kind of show, and I will explain how we could even take this a step further. So this is an example from an integrated one math class. This was the original part of a test, the very first question. You can see that in bold, it says, make sure you show all your work, check your answer. We're talking about pretty complex equations. And then the next slide will show how this particular teacher, I cannot take credit for this. This was one of our inclusion specialists that's at one of the high schools, and she's did the entire course and the next course and is amazing. So you can see that she put in down at the bottom very guided steps for how they could access this. So this is great for some students. For some, even just having the X in there may be too much. So a way you can take this even further is you might have a student that is strictly working on single digit addition. That is a skill that is related to being able to solve an equation. So we can scale it down as much as the students need to make it accessible. So there might be some students that their test might just say 5 plus 12. And that's totally okay. It is related to the standard. The next, go ahead, Michelle.
So we also have some students who are working on like number sense recognition. And so this is a great example of like using the same material, right? So if a student's trying to identify their numbers, or maybe which number is greater or smaller, you could still use the same test and point to letter A, that portion of it, and say which number is the largest, right? And it doesn't even matter that there's letters there. So it's, again, even on the tests, there's ways to make it accessible and relatable to what their IEP goals outline, and what they're able to work on is still pushing them to their next step, right? Because again, we don't want to just have them in the class and get them through. We still want to push their abilities and their skill sets too.
And that's a great point to follow up with that too. One of the biggest things is there doesn't have to be something separate created. So that's something that we talk about a lot when we go out to school sites to support. For an example, like that math page, it could be that they are just highlighting all the 5s if that's what they're working on. And what we've learned, particularly when we get into the secondary spaces, a lot of our students start to realize that their work looks different and they don't like that. So we want to utilize what the rest of the class is using so that they have that access and they feel like an integrated part of the class and not like they're just sitting there taking up a seat. This one was an example from a biology class. This was actually 20 different stations. Each one, this was on the circulatory system. So this was for a student of mine who had very limited capabilities when it came to reading. Everything that I did for him had to have picture support. And there was a lot of behaviors and many layers to this particular kiddo. So this was just one of the stations. So he had to match. He had a lot of fine motor challenges. So even looking at the way this was set up, it wasn't accessible for him. He couldn't write the letter A, B, or C. Even drawing lines was a challenge. So the next one will show you how I adapted this for him. So same content, just added visuals to it, and all he had to do was match the picture to the function. So it could have been that he just took a dauber and daubed the same color on it. It could be that he used a thicker marker and drew a line. It could be that he used his AAC device and told his instructional assistant which one it was, red, white. We have programmed in vocabulary for students' AAC devices in the past to make it more accessible as well. Another way that we could have done this is we could have just eliminated the lab worksheet and just had him do the hands-on component. So lots of different ways to be flexible with curriculum that otherwise would be really challenging for our students. And this was also something that his instructional assistant was with him. They did it actually in peer groups. So he walked through it with peers who also supported. This last example is from a 10th grade English class. So they're reading a novel called American Like Me, which is memoirs from many different, it's actors and actresses and novelists and people from all different walks of life and cultures. So this was the original assignment. So you can see they have the passage on the left, and on the right side, it talks about like, what is the purpose of the story? How does it set the tone? The questions that went along with this were very complicated questions and required a lot of analyzing of the text. The language is very high level. So like the word efficiently, the exquisite, precise, things that are probably higher level vocabulary than some of our students could access. So I took this and instead made what was on the next page something accessible. So when I order the grande chai latte at Starbucks, I almost always lie. So then we just put in, what does she order? It might seem like that's, not necessarily as close to what they were doing as the rest of the class, but they're still using the exact same material. It looks the same, it just has those visuals, and then it's something that they could access within the classroom setting. So a lot of our work, we take and structurally try to make it look very, very similar to what the rest of the class is using. But then it doesn't create a classroom within a classroom, which, like you've said over and over, is kind of the biggest thing. Our kids need to feel included. There's no reason for them to be in the room sitting and, they're in the back with a packet and everyone else is sitting reading this excerpt together. So it's something that we've worked really, really hard on, and probably the number one thing that I would encourage when you're looking at creating curriculum is how do we make it look similar to what everyone is doing, but also making it accessible for our students.
And that conversation has expanded not just in this space, but also just in our co-taught and collaborative classroom spaces for our students accessing a traditional high school diploma. And so some of the strategies that have come up are things like having if you use Canvas or Google Classroom or things like that, having the students grouped in that way. And so as you're sending out the assignments, right, the students don't know that there's anything else, because the assignment that's popping up on their screen is the assignment for them. And it looks similar enough to where if somebody glances at someone's screen, it's not as noticeable. So in some of our classes, like English and history, who do use a lot of technology, that is a support that we've found that has been really helpful, and adding kind of that layer of communication between that inclusion specialist and that teacher, so that that teacher can be the one to push out the assignment through those systems, instead of having, we still have this a lot, where we have a binder of materials, right, that are ready to go and accessible as needed. But when those opportunities arise to kind of plan for things a little bit more in advance, when we have staff on site, that has been a really great strategy too.
And for us, again, I think we're a little bit unique in the sense that we have always had full inclusion students. So this was not new for a lot of our teachers. They've had students with significant disabilities in their classrooms. So it wasn't as big of like a shock of how do I interact with this student. I would say the biggest thing that we learned is that this process is hard and it's a lot, and people always want to do best for the students is really what we've learned. Like, we have to give each other grace that this is a huge learning curve. General ed teachers, I have a multiple subject credential, so I started as a gen ed teacher. When you don't have training in specific disabilities and what this looks like and how we incorporate them in the classroom, that training piece was huge, and it is ongoing. We have conversations all the time. We get emails constantly. And the biggest thing that I can say is to make sure that you're giving everybody grace, and everything changes year to year. And once you kind of get in the groove of it, it's really beautiful the way the classrooms run now, with everybody integrated, everybody working together, the peers step in to help. And it's funny because sometimes our kids will like push their instructional assistants away because they have like a peer buddy that wants to be the person to help. So beautiful things can come out of all this. It just takes time and a lot of work.
For sure. So we finished a little bit early. I know there's a little bit of a closure piece, but we wanted to open it up if you guys have any questions or any clarifications based on kind of anything that we presented. If not, then the SIP team can give their closure, and then we'll give you a little bit of free time, but we're here if you need it. Maylene, I see your hand up.
Yes, hi. This is such a great presentation because this is something that is very new. We don't know. We keep on going back and forth on what to do. So the adaptation is really like I've seen it. If we have if students are coming in from other districts, but in our district, we really don't use it. Where do you see that on the IEP? Like on the services page, will it be under modification or accommodation?
That's a great question. Go ahead, Michelle.
Yeah, I think there's two different spots that it'll show up. It'll typically show up under the accommodations section. And so we'll identify that they have maybe access to the standard extenders, or they have access to adapted curriculum. And then we also, if they do have specific needs for inclusion support, so some of our students, have some significant strengths. And so we've had students take AP Studio Art and calculus and lots of things where they had some very large like splinter skills, right? Or significant areas of interest. And so in those cases, we see the need for that more intensive inclusion support because those are courses that most students don't take. So we don't have materials for those. So if there is a need for inclusion specialist support, staff training, or things like that, peer buddy facilitation, those things tend to go under the other support section on the services page.
Got it. Thank you. And one more question, sorry. So what does your inclusion specialist role look like? Is it like per school, or are they itinerant? Are they like support providers?
Yeah, so we are not a service. We are written in as other support. So we have certain hours based on the level of work that we need to do for each student. The majority of the students we support, we do 20 hours a year on their IEP. And it looks different for every student. There are some students where we are modifying almost everything that they do. There are some students where we focus more on kind of that staff training. We have a lot of really good instructional assistants. So we spend a lot of our time with training our instructional assistants. We have a team of COSAs that go around and they do like virtual trainings. So a lot of time is poured into that. On kind of the day-to-day, so there are 4 of us, 2 of us that support elementary, 2 of us that support middle school, and then for this year, we've had 1 inclusion specialist at every high school. We are itinerant, so our high school inclusion specialists are housed at their individual site that they support. And then the other 4 of us who support middle school and elementary are housed at an elementary site, and we go out and support. So I have 3 middle schools and support the high school teams. My partner, she supports 3 of the middle schools and a couple of the elementary sites, and then 2 of us support all of the elementary. And we are a fairly large district, so it's a lot, and we are spread across, a lot of kids at a lot of sites. So it takes a lot of communication, and, each one of us kind of does our things a little bit different for how we check in with our teams, but it really just is based on kind of our individual, preferences for how we communicate with our teams. But we're all itinerant. We kind of bounce around and work with everybody. There's a lot.
And for clarification, because we used an acronym, I see we put it in the chat. COSA for us is a classified on special assignment. So these are instructional assistants who have been given the amazing opportunity, and they are amazing people, which is why this position was created, to provide support, which is like mentorship, training, go in and help school sites and things like that, with various things. But also with our high school inclusion specialists, 2 of them were also, they were 50% inclusion specialists and 50% extensive support needs teachers. So there's also some flexibility there depending on the numbers you have. Obviously, not all of our high schools have the same level of students in these accessing these programmatic options. And then next year we are that all will be readjusted based on the numbers of students and kind of where those needs lie too. So it was kind of a short-term intervention for us to try and build some of those curriculum banks and things like that to try and get this up and running as quickly as possible.